Hi, my name is Mrs. Moss, and this is 2 Minutes of Grammar. Today we're going to talk about active and passive voice. Active and passive voice have to do with verbs, and verbs can be very complex. We can talk about verb tenses, we can talk about verb moods, but today we're talking about voice. We have active and passive voice. With active voice, the subject acts upon the verb. So if I were to say, James turned on the lights, James, subject, turned, verb, and then lights, direct object. But James turned, the subject is doing the verb. Typically, that's how we write, that's how we naturally speak, and we just go on about our day talking and writing in active voice. Passive voice does have a purpose, but you probably should not use it very often in formal papers and research papers. Passive voice is when the subject is the recipient of the action. So if I were to flip that sentence, I would say the lights were turned on by James. Light subject, were turned verb. Passive voice, the lights are not turning themselves on. James is doing it. That's passive voice. So when do you use passive voice? Typically, you use it very rarely. Passive voice is often used by web sources, news sources to avoid drawing attention to someone who doesn't really deserve attention. So you'll hear in the news people say the house was robbed. They're simply not giving attention to the person who did something wrong. And that's typically appropriate, and they'll leave off the by preposition. The house was robbed, and they'll just leave it at that because the house deserves the attention as the subject instead of whoever did something bad. Another time that people use passive voice, and this is what you always have to be careful of, is politicians and people who don't want to take claim for something will use it to avoid taking ownership of a problem often. So you'll hear people say, the system is rigged. Well, who rigged the system? And so you need to always ask yourself that. Did politicians rig the system? Did authority figures? Who rigged the system? And so that is something that I want you to ask yourself when you hear the passive voice used. So, to summarize, active voice is when the subject acts upon the verb. Passive voice is when the subject is the recipient of the verb's action. We overwhelmingly write in active voice, but it is okay to write in passive voice if you do so with purpose. If you hear someone speaking or writing in passive voice, be sure to ask yourself why. All right, I'll be back with more grammar videos.